To tell you folks about just getting the most from your SPEEDLIGHT system and its accessories today. It's important to know that we are live from the Air National Guard Training Education Center at McGee-Tyson Air National Guard Base in Knoxville, Tennessee. And if those of you out there want to fax me in some questions for a Q&A later on today, that number is DSN 266-3880. We're going to talk about Nikon SPEEDLIGHT system today, and it is an extensive system of SPEEDLIGHTs and accessories that will help you make better flash pictures. In today's program, it consists of two parts. The first part will be the camera and SPEEDLIGHT technology. And the camera and SPEEDLIGHT technology will be covering TTL multi-sensor, monitor pre-flash, and distance information, the camera and SPEEDLIGHT settings themselves, some terminology like TTL, standard TTL, and 3D multi-sensor balanced fill flash and what they are and what they do, as well as we'll cover extensively flash synchronization, flash bracketing, and flash compensation. In part 2 of the program, we'll cover the Nikon multiple flash system. We'll go over the SPEEDLIGHTs for use for multiple flash. We'll talk about the flash modes and how to use them in a multiple flash setup. And finally, we'll show you some multiple flash setups that we shot here at Air National Guard yesterday, and then we'll take some questions from the field. On the camera and SPEEDLIGHT technology, we're going to cover the Nikon's exclusive TTL multi-sensor, monitor pre-flash, and distance information. Nikon's exclusive TTL multi-sensor is a 5-segment sensor system that's found on our N90S cameras, the F100, the F5, and film cameras, and our D1 series cameras. Basically, the flash is calculated from the information gathered by the 5 TTL sensors. What's interesting about the sensors is they are arranged in a rule of thirds arrangement, typical for compositional aspect ratios. The shutter curtain on the 5-segment TTL system is coated with a gray material that's actually 18% reflectance. That plays an important role in the next segment, which was what we call monitor pre-flash. Now, monitor pre-flash is emitted from the flash just prior to the shutter opening and taking the picture. It calculates the subject reflectance against an 18% value and applies the appropriate flash compensation right before the shot is made. So subjects that are predominantly very bright colored, like white shirts and white pants, or brightly colored clothing like that, are automatically compensated by the flash. Conversely, if the subject is dark, such as a night picture, or where you have a wide expansive background, the monitor pre-flash can calculate that information and apply that algorithm to the entire flash exposure. And then the third piece of the puzzle in our flash exposure is what we call distance integration. Distance integration is incorporated into every Nikon AF series lens. And if you notice on your lenses, there's a little D designation, and that's the first clue that these lenses will transmit distance information to the cameras. Now, what's important about this is that for flash photography, flash to subject distance, one of the prerequisites in getting an accurate flash exposure, is now calculated and measured and coordinated through the Nikon camera and SPEEDLIGHT once they're hooked up and they're talking to each other. Camera and SPEEDLIGHT settings. We're going to talk about TTL benefits and what TTL actually means, standard TTL. We're going to talk about 3D multi-sensor balanced fill flash in depth, flash synchronization, flash bracketing, and flash compensation. TTL, or through the lens, is the way that flash is calculated. As you place a filter on your lens, or lens extension becomes a factor, such as when using a micro Nikkor lens or a lens with a teleconverter, when you change an aperture from one aperture to another, whether you're shooting a shallow depth of field and a medium depth of field or a small aperture, when you change your ISO, or when you change your focal length, the benefits of TTL is that now that the flash exposure can be calculated instantaneously as you apply any one of these things to your camera. Standard TTL is a terminology that we use in our instruction manuals and our camera manuals, and it is the mode in which you shoot flash where the flash is not balancing the exposure with the ambient light. It's an important way to use your flash because in standard TTL, monitor pre-flash, which we talked about before, becomes canceled for 35mm cameras. And what happens here is that when you shoot a picture that has a busy background, or if you're taking a picture of a tabletop setup like product photography and things like that, the camera and the flash will not balance the ambient light. You're going for basic flash exposure based on flash to subject distance and aperture set. In the example on the left of these musicians here, that was the case where we had an extremely busy background. There were lots of lights going off in the background. People were milling about, and I thought that would be too distracting. So what I did was I turned off multi-sensor balanced fill flash, activated standard TTL, and calculated my flash to subject distance using the LCD on the back of the Speedlight. And now you see the photograph, you see that the subject is perfectly exposed, but the background has gone darker. In the photograph at right, it's a tabletop product photography, very straightforward. There was no need to balance the ambient light with the flash, so standard TTL was chosen for this example. 3D multi-sensor fill flash is perhaps the most sophisticated of all the flash modes on your camera in flash. Using Nikon's exclusive 5-segment TTL sensor as the basis for all exposure and monitor pre-flash along with distance information, 3D multi-sensor fill flash provides a seamless balance between flash and ambient light. When you use our SB28 Speedlight along with one of our 35mm film cameras, you'll see that symbol on your Speedlight LCD. You'll see the words TTL and you'll see the little multi-sensor symbol. When you're shooting with a D1 series camera, you'll see the TTL and you'll see a D nomenclature next to it, and you'll also see the multi-sensor symbol as well, indicating that you're ready for DTTL for digital cameras with 3D multi-sensor fill flash. In our first example here, we see a comparison of a model that I've taken a picture of. And in my position with the company, I'm very fortunate in that I can get to go out and take a diverse type of subject matter. And here I was working with a model, and I wanted to show a comparison of what it was like to shoot with and without flash. In the photograph at the left, you see the flash was not used, and because the background was fairly well lit, the camera's light meter exposed for the entire scene, and the area of shadow, which in this case was the model's face under the big brimmed hat, went entirely dark. By turning on my Speedlight, I was able to integrate Speedlight exposure with the ambient light exposure for a seamless coordination of the two so that the photograph looked as close to naturally lit as possible. In the next example, very similar to this, but here was a little different. Exposure was okay for most of the photograph, but if you notice the eyes under the brim of the hat, the eyes went dark and you really can't see what this model looks like. So by providing 3D multi-sensor balanced fill flash here, not only was the highlight detail retained, but the shadow detail was brought out in a much more natural looking photograph and a much more attractive photograph. The next sequence of photos shows one of my favorite techniques that we'll be discussing in a little while, and that's the technique of slow sync photography. In slow sync, you can balance the exposure with a longer shutter speed for lower ambient light. And here I was at a fish market, and what we're seeing is the salesman who's putting the fish into the bag, and the exposure was around a 1/15 or an 1/8 of a second, also in 3D multi-sensor, but it captured the feeling of motion under that low light interior. On the right side, we're back to the model again, and it was actually about 4 in the afternoon here in New York time, and the light level had dropped precipitously. And by going to a slow sync flash mode here, I was able to balance the exposure again for a very natural looking flash to ambient light photograph. In this photo here, I wanted to show you really what fill flash was all about. Film itself has a narrow contrast range that it can record exposure. It's about 10 or 11 f-stops. The human eye has an infinite range that we can see and adjust to. When you take a photograph that has a wide contrast range, such as this photo at left, where the building is in bright sunlight and the statuary in the front was in dark shadow, you've got a choice mentally here of either exposing for the shadow, in which case you'll expose that shadow detail perfectly, but the building in the background would become vastly overexposed. You can expose for the building in the background like I did here with the center weighted meter, but the shadow goes extremely dark. Or you can expose for that background and turn on your Nikon Speedlight for just the right blend of fill flash, so that now that wide contrast range has been narrowed to form a very natural looking photograph. Flash synchronization is very, very important to understand, and it's outlined extensively in our instruction manuals. We use three different terminologies. We use the terminology normal flash synchronization, we use slow synchronization, and we use rear synchronization. When you're shooting a normal synchronization, that's typically where you want to be for the majority of your daylight photos and even the majority of your indoor photos. The flash fires when the shutter is released. The flash speed is coordinated so that the camera will set in an automatic mode, such as aperture priority or in program, from 1/60th of a second to the top shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. When you're shooting with D1 digital series cameras, that top TTL shutter speed becomes 1/500th of a second, and now expanding your range that flash photography can be used. It's important to know too that when you're shooting with flash, in any of the techniques, they operate with all the light meters in our cameras, which is the matrix meter or the 3D color matrix, with the center weighted meter, and with all 5 spot meters. They also work in all exposure modes. Normal synchronization can also be used with TTL exposure for precise and accurate through the lens metering. It can be used in A mode or AA mode if you're using the DCS series cameras, or you can use it for manual techniques as well. And that will become very, very important as we get into multiple flash photography later on in the program. If you look at the photograph here that I took at an air show recently, I used D1. I shot at normal synchronization to the 500th of a second at f8, and the camera coordinated the ambient light and flash exposure under bright light conditions absolutely perfectly. The second exposure at the same air show was a tight portrait that I did, and this was a little trickier in that there was a lot of highlight and a lot of shadow detail. I wanted to retain that highlight detail, so I metered the left side of the airman's face with center weighted metering, and then I turned on my speedlight and balanced the shadow area with the highlight area. Slow synchronization is a really interesting technique. Nikon technology allows you to balance your speed light with the ambient light under dimmer lighting conditions. And this can be any situation that you can think of. It can be a sunset situation. It could be a sunrise. It could be an overcast day where the lighting is dropped. It can be an interior where you're trying to light an entire interior, or it can be a subject set within an interior setting where the light level is dropped and you want to balance the ambient light with that longer shutter speed and the flash itself. There are two examples that I'm going to show you here. And the first one on the left was taken with normal flash synchronization at 5/6 of a second, at 1/60th of a second at f5.6. Technically a correct exposure, but we really can't see what's happening in the background. By setting my D1X to slow sync, and that's done with a lightning bolt symbol on the D1X, holding down the button, turning my main command dial until the word slow appears on my LCD. Now the camera was free to choose at the same f-stop I had selected before the correct ambient light exposure shutter speed, in this case 1/10 of a second, balancing perfectly. It's a wonderful technique. It's one I use probably most in my photography, whether I'm in bright light or whether I'm in dim light. In the next two examples, I've also shot slow sync, but I must caution you that because the shutter speed can drop to a very, very low light level, depending on what you want to do, you really need to use a tripod for those situations. The photograph on the left at the air show was done without a tripod at a 15th of a second at f4.5 in my favorite shooting mode, aperture priority mode. However, at the beach, it was a pretty beautiful sunset, but there was no way I was going to hold the camera at a quarter of a second at f11. So I took out my tripod, mounted the camera on there, and set my exposure accordingly for a perfect blend of flash to ambient light. Now, rear synchronization combines what I just told you about slow sync in that it can balance the ambient light exposure with dimmer ambient lighting conditions, but the caveat here is that the flash fires at the end of the exposure process. And what that does is that if you're photographing with any subject that entails any kind of motion, someone running, someone cycling, a car moving, etc., the trail of motion will appear behind the subject instead of in front of it. Now, slow sync and rear sync can be exposed all the way down to the camera's slowest shutter speed of 30 full seconds in an automatic mode. So you can shoot in program mode or aperture priority mode, physically set an aperture, and now what will happen is the camera will choose the appropriate shutter speed. You can also choose shutter priority or manual exposure control and set the physical shutter speed based on the parameters you need to do your type of photography. I have some terrific examples of rear sync photography, and I tend to have a lot of fun with that when I'm taking pictures with kids and family and things like that. I went to a local amusement park with some friends and got on the ride, which was miraculous in itself because I don't really like to go on rides. But I was challenged by making some pictures in the rear sync mode, got on the ride, put the camera to program mode, put the camera up to my face, and then let the camera and its technology do the rest. Later, when I got off the ride, mounted the camera on a tripod and went for an overall view of this ride itself. And you can see the natural trail of motion, the beautiful blend of ambient light to flash. And it's a technique that I frankly, I don't think I could have done without this technology being in the camera itself. Okay. In the next situation of a rear sync, I was out in Las Vegas taking pictures and I found my way into a magic shop. And I was very frustrated in that I wasn't getting the kinds of pictures that I thought I could be getting. And then I realized that to capture the magician doing his magic and his sleight of hand, I needed to apply some sleight of hand myself. And that's where rear sync on my camera came in. And with rear sync, the ambient light level dropped to a 1/15 of a second at 5.6. I was in shutter priority mode, but I was able to capture that feeling of the magician doing his trick and the card suspended and floating in space. Recently I was at a cook-off competition, and here was a gentleman here who was actually roasting some chili peppers. I took a series of photos at normal synchronization, but they looked very static. So I went to rear synchronization, aperture priority mode, and then while I was in aperture priority and realized that was a slow enough shutter speed to record the trail of motion, I also zoomed my zoom lens while exposing, and that further created that feeling of motion in the photograph. Going to the opposite end of the balancing spectrum, we had rear sync and slow sync for low ambient light. Now I'm going to tell you about a technique that you might not be applying to your bright ambient light conditions, and that's called FP high-speed sync. FP high-speed sync is a mode found on your SB28, on your SB28DX speed lights. And what it does is it allows you to change the synchronization speed from 2/50th or 500th on D1 up to 1/4000th of a second on the 35mm film cameras and up to 1/8000th of a second with your D1 series cameras. It's a very simple technique to do, but it requires you to go out of the TTL mode and into the manual mode. Once you're in manual mode, you press the mode button until you get to FP mode. When you get to FP mode, then you're in the FP synchronization mode and great things can happen. If you're using the trio of zoom lenses that I know are probably in your gadget bags now, the 17-35, the 28-70, or the 80-200 AFS zoom Nikkor lenses, one of the reasons you use this is their great optical quality and their ability to shoot in lower ambient light at 2.8. The frustration here is that when you go outside in bright ambient light, try to take a picture, fill flash, your camera tells you it's going to be a 2/50th at f11, excuse me, 2/50th at f16. Now you want to use those lenses at 2.8 so you can separate the subject from the background. By going into the FP mode, you simply dial in the shutter speed you want to use at the corresponding f-stop. The LCD on the back of the speedlight will guide you as to the distance you must be from the subject. Once you got all that information, you're free to take your fill flash pictures in the FP mode, and now you can shoot at those wide apertures in bright daylight. I've got two examples to show you here, and one is of a musician down at Epcot Center in Disney World. I needed to change my position because there were tourists and other photographers all over the place, and I really wasn't getting the shot and the vantage point I wanted. When I moved around the subject along with my 80-200 2.8 lens, I found these beautiful lights over her shoulder, but the camera was reading 2/50th at f11, and I knew by pressing my depth of field button and prior experience that f11, the background would be competing with the foreground. So I went to the FP mode, I dialed up my shutter speed and dialed down my aperture until I got the two that I wanted and took the picture, and I got a beautiful balance between flash and ambient light at a very wide maximum aperture. The same is true of the photograph of my daughter Mary at the bottom. Recently she was at a T-ball game, and this is one of those spontaneous moments that you really need to think fast on your feet. She was sitting in front of a god-awful batting cage, and I knew if I took that picture in normal TTL mode, the batting cage and the picture of my daughter Mary would be competing for one another. So I automatically went into FP mode, I dialed down my aperture to 2.8, and I dialed up my shutter speed to 4,000 and took the picture, and now I have a photograph of her, still with the same busy background, but you really can tell. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to shoot anytime you have subjects like that. Now, we build some great features and technology into our cameras to help you make better flash pictures. One of those technologies is called flash bracketing. It's built into the D1 series cameras, the F5, and the F100 film camera. And along with the N90S and its companion MF26 multi-control back, you can do that same technique with that camera as well. Now, flash bracketing is a great way to give yourself several photographs in a sequence that might have different purposes at the back end when you're out there editing and looking over the work with your editors. You might be out and be expected to go do a slide presentation for a group of people, and you know that when you project, slightly underexposed slides favor projection. Conversely, you know that you might go to a print medium, you might find that the shot that's just slightly overexposed might be better for printing, to hold all the value in there. So I use flash bracketing just for that reason, to control the situation of flash and to give me a variation on all the different pictures that I'm going to be getting. Now when you use flash bracketing, you can change the your EVs from 1/3, 1/2, or 1 step on the D1, the F5, and the F100. And with your N90S and its multi-control back, you can change that in 1/3 EV steps. So you can get quite a bit of range on your flash exposures when you use flash bracketing. In this example here, I chose an extensive series of bracketing actually, but I'm only showing you 3 in this sequence. I really didn't know how the shot was going to come out because of the wide contrast range, and I didn't know how I was going to use it later. I knew that I had to put together a PowerPoint presentation, but I didn't know if I was going to be projecting this image later on or using it for print medium. So I chose bracketing increments on EV values of 1. And in the photograph at top, it's an EV plus 1. Extreme backlighting plus compensation works a little bit better in some cases. EV minus 1, it's a little more underexposed, but it actually looks quite natural there. And then EV minus 2, you can see, is actually a little too dark. So flash bracketing lets you take consecutive photographs without interrupting the sequence. We move on to flash compensation, and unlike flash bracketing, this is built into the SPEEDLIGHT itself. With flash compensation, you can modify your flash output from +1 EV to -3 EV in 1/3 EV steps. The great thing about flash compensation is you can do it on the fly, you can change it from photograph to photograph, and like flash bracketing, it does not affect the ambient light portion of the scene. Interestingly enough, flash bracketing and flash compensation all can be combined with exposure compensation. Now that's when I take out the little pen and the pad that I carry with me and I jot down some notes, because that can get to be quite confusing. You're applying one compensation to the camera and you're applying another one to the SPEEDLIGHT. It's an effective technique for shooting in an automatic mode, but one that requires you to take some copious notes. I can only tell you that from previous experience. And the example on the left that I'm going to show you here is an example of flash compensation. I took 2 pictures, and on the first picture on the left I used +1 compensation. It was a wide contrast range, there were subjects in the background and subject off to the right, and it was fairly bright outside. And I also took one at EV -1. Here is a perfect example of how you would gauge flash compensation. And I can only tell you from my personal experience that the way I learn about flash compensation is that whatever film I like to shoot, whatever lenses I like to use, and whatever scenarios I find myself photographing in, I always shoot a test beforehand. I shoot an extensive test, I write notes down, and when I lay my film on a light table, I look at what the camera and the flash produce themselves in an automatic mode, with my help with flash compensation, and I jot down those notes, and I find that later on when I'm out in those situations, it's very easy for me to recall what I had done simply by going through that exercise, just what type of compensation, if I need any, and what type of flash I'm going to use for that photograph. Part 2 of our program is now going to be a little more in depth, but it's going to encompass multiple flash photography. Now, what is multiple flash photography? Well, multiple flash photography simply is the technique of using more than one SPEEDLIGHT to illuminate a subject. It can be 2 SPEEDLIGHTs, it can be 3 SPEEDLIGHTs, and it can be any combination greater than that. Some important terminology as we move along in multiple flash photography is the main light. The main light supplies most of the light to the photograph. The fill light is going to lighten the shadows that are caused by the main light. And then typically in a 3-light setup, there's a background light. And the background light can be used to visually separate the subject from the background. And we will see some examples just how we did that. The speed lights that you're going to be using for your work are going to be the SB50DX, which is a brand new speed light and very exciting. I'm going to tell you about that in a second. And the SB28 series and the SB28DX speed lights. These are all wonderful and versatile speed lights that have a lot of power and a lot of versatility and can be used singly or in multiple flash setups, and they work really quite well. It's like having a portable lighting studio in your gadget bag. The SB50DX we call Creative Lighting Made Easy. And the SB50DX is our newest speed light, and it's quite interesting. It's very compact, but what I like best about this speed light is it's got its own built-in sensor on the side here. Now you can have a speed light and wireless flash incorporated all into one unit. The SB50DX has a fairly robust guide number of 72. It's about a stop difference in lighting between your SB28 or your SB28DX, giving you a nice lighting ratio of equal distance. It's got built-in wireless TTL if you're using 35mm camera, and if you're using digital, you've got manual control as well. Another exciting aspect to the SB50DX is it comes with its own onboard IR infrared filter. It clips onto the front, the flash head itself, and it can now be used to trigger other satellite speed lights set up in a wireless situation that are completely off camera, and you will not have any illumination from the flash at the camera position. The IR trigger works in both manual and TTL modes, and it triggers non-visible light. It's important to know that there will be light coming out of your speed light, but it will be non-visible, especially for your film and your compact flash cards if you're using digital media. What it does is, as you set up your multiple situation, and we see this is one of the photographs we took yesterday, I had to use it in manual control because I was using my digital D1X. And remember we talked beginning about pre-flash, monitor pre-flash. Well, if monitor pre-flash has to be canceled in order to do a wireless picture. Otherwise, the pre-flash will go off and set off those satellite speed lights. Excuse me. Well, in digital, monitor pre-flash controls pretty much all aspects of exposure except for manual control. So by going to manual control with your digital camera, you get no monitor pre-flash to interface with your satellite speed lights. The SB50DX incorporates an audible alert signal. So when you have your speed lights placed and you take a photograph, the audible alert will now sound letting you know if your exposure was okay. It'll give you a continuous tone, or if your power was too great for the subject and requiring you to move it back or away from the subject by giving you a very loud, continuous with an interrupted tone. Similar to the SU4 in operation, it's now built into the speed light. The SU4 is a very popular accessory that many of you might have in your gadget bags, and I'll cover that in a few minutes, but that's an accessory that allows you to place it on any Nikon TTL speed light and perform wireless multiple flash with that. And the SB50DX is also available for film cameras, digital cameras, and just be aware that when you do use it on your film cameras, you have total TTL control. You can set those cameras manually and the flash manually if you would like to, but for digital SLR, you must set it for manual control. The IR filter can be stored on top of the flash head, giving you great convenience when carrying it around. It's always with you. And once again, that IR filter is an infrared filter that allows you to shoot TTL or manual multiple flash. It triggers non-visible light to activate your satellite speed lights. The exposure is only recorded from the satellite speed lights, not from the camera's position. And that IR filter is stored easily on top of the flash head. It's always with you when you're taking pictures. The SB28 speed light is what we call the ultimate in Nikon flash photography. It can be used for your 35mm SLR and also for your digital SLR, but on your digital D1 series cameras, you would have to use it in a non-TTL mode, such as non-TTL auto or on manual mode. It's got a full information LCD. It provides 3D multi-sensor balanced fill flash, FP sync, and is a wonderful flash that is, I know, pretty much in all of your gadget bags out there. The photograph I'm going to show you here was a very straightforward photograph. Flash on camera, flash off camera with an SE17 cord placed to the left, providing a little bit of dimension, TTL exposure. I'm typically an aperture priority shooter, and that's the way I went with this photograph. The SB28DX provides all of the functionality of the SB28, except that the electronics and the algorithms have been changed to work with your digital SLR cameras. Now, you've got to understand that your digital SLR does not have a film plane, so there's no exposure to be recorded off the film plane. So the algorithms of this Speedlight have been changed. The monitor pre-flash has been changed to play a more versatile role in flash exposure, and that's how the amazing accuracy is recorded with an SB28DX and a D1X or a D1H series camera. You still get all the benefits, just like the SB28. You get 3D multi-sensor balanced fill flash, but in this case for D1, and it's called DTTL. You get standard TTL for D1. You get an AA mode for D1, where you're using the flash sensor on front of the flash instead of the TTL exposure through the lens. And you also have manual exposure. If you want to use one flash for both your film cameras and your digital cameras, this is the one I would recommend, the SB28DX, because it operates perfectly with your F5, your F100, and your N90S series cameras. In the photograph of the airman that I showed you before, I took the camera, Speedlight, on camera, very simple to do, 500th of a second, pop off that flash, preview on my LCD, check exposure accuracy, and move on to the next subject. Some of the accessories you might want to use for successful multiple flash photography are the SU4. The SU4 is a wireless flash controller. It attaches to the bottom of any Nikon Speedlight. So if you have the current Speedlights, the SB28 or SB28DX, even some older Speedlights like the SB24, the SB25, and even the SB26 can be used with the SU4 wireless controller. There's the SC17 off-camera cord, which is perhaps the most important Nikon flash accessory you can carry. It allows you to take your Speedlight off camera and avoid that on-camera harsh flash look and create submodeling on your subject. You've got the AS10 adapter, which allows you to put one of our SC18 or SC19 cords directly into this adapter and into your Speedlight for corded control of multiple flash. The AS15 adapter, which gives you a hot shoe for placing a Speedlight on top, as well as 3 additional corded satellite Speedlights that can be controlled through the cord system. The SC18 and SC19 cords are 1 meter and 3 meters in length. They've been in our line for a long time, and you can do terrific and exciting corded TTL remote photography. And one that you don't often think about, but I carry with me everywhere, called the SD8A battery pack. The SD8A battery pack extends shooting capacity. It runs on AA batteries or AA rechargeables, whatever you're using in your Speedlight, you would also use in your SD8A. It just gives you that added ability to shoot faster. It gives you that added ability to shoot for a prolonged period of time, especially when you're working wireless multiple flash and you're working in the manual mode. You get a tremendous amount of flash power out of that accessory. The shooting modes for multiple flash are no different than the shooting modes for on-camera flash photography. You've got TTL mode, both standard TTL and balanced fill flash TTL. You've got A mode control for those of you who like to shoot A mode, or if you have a camera like the DCS series and you're using one of the Nikon flashes and does not work TTL with that camera. And then you've got manual control in manual mode. Let's look at TTL control first. When you're shooting with a Nikon 35mm camera, F5, F100, N90S, the vulnerable F3, and our newest series FM3A camera, TTL automatically controls the output and flash duration of all the Speedlights. When you're doing a multiple flash setup, the equal amounts of power from each flash is divided. All this is calculated instantaneously by the camera's onboard computer. And all of our 35mm AF film cameras provide TTL control while engaged in a multiple flash setup. For non-TTL control, the output changes automatically again, but it's from a sensor located on the speed light. Your light is not going through the lens. Careful placement is necessary of the speed lights when you're working in a non-TTL mode because the sensor can be adversely affected by subject reflectance. If you're photographing and you place that speed light again pointed at someone who's wearing a dark shirt again or a big expansive background, that speed light can be adversely affected into putting out too much light. So placement of these speed lights is very, very important and requires some testing beforehand. But using non-TTL, you can use both the 35mm SLRs and digital SLRs that we currently make. Manual mode for multiple flash is our third mode of shooting. And in manual mode, the maximum amount of light fires each time at a fixed duration. Exposure is calculating using the flash to subject distance method. And I like to use the LCD on the back of my speed light as my guide because the flash to subject distance is very precise. And as you select an aperture on your camera, that information is transmitted exactly on the back of the LCD of the speed light. A control mechanism that you can use even in manual control is flash compensation. You can use flash compensation and dial your speed light down, and you can use what we call power ratio. And in power ratio control, each time you press the button for power ratio, the power of the speed light in manual mode is taken down in third step increments. Manual mode you can use for both 35mm and your digital SLR as well. And possibly for me, when I'm working in manual flash, when I'm working in multiple flash, particularly wireless, I like to use manual control. I just find it a more logical setup for me. I can control each speed light and the distance of my subject to the speed light using the LCD on the back, and it works quite easily whenever I'm in a multiple flash situation. Okay, now, before we get into the photographs, I want to give you the number to call in so you can ask some questions for our Q&A session. The phone number is 1-800-524-8842. Once again, the phone number is 1-800-524-8842. If you missed the fax number, that number is DSN 266-3880. DSN 266-3880, and I'm looking forward to hearing some questions from you out there in the field. So yesterday I was out here at the Air National Guard, and I worked with a couple of incredible people who were courteous enough to give me their cooperation and were patient enough to work with me as I went through the paces and try to provide for you some photographs that I think you might take in your situation. But let me run through the paces of multiple flash in the Nikon system and show how easy it was to work with this system. The first flash setup, we see a sergeant on the left, and he was putting the M16s away on a rack. I used one flash here, but the background went dark. I placed the second speed light on the background, and that lit the background up quite nicely, separated the subject from the background. Then I added a third speed light directly behind him, but with a red colored gel that I had Velcroed onto my speed light, so it created a nice outline around him, and also off to the, if you see on the picture here, to his right, you get some red highlights in there. So it added just a third dimension to the photograph. Quite easy to do. I used the LCD on my D1X to preview each exposure. I used manual mode of the flashes. I carefully placed them, took the photographs, and then moved on to the next subject. The next subject was a formal portrait. I know you're going to have to do this out in the field, and I know you don't get a lot of time to do this. So here's a photograph, typical on camera, vertical position, very harsh shadow, very harsh lighting in the background. Matter of fact, that shadow in the background is too defined for my taste. The first step was to take the flash off camera using an SC17 cord. It made the photograph a lot better, but I still had some heavy deep shadow on the Master Sergeant's left side here. Then I added a second speed light, an SB28DX connected to an SU4, and we have a very natural two-light scenario, very easy to do in the field, down and dirty, nothing fancy about it. Works great. We next moved on to a group shot. In the group shot here, the people in the back row were pretty much lost from the power of the speedlight, and they blend in with the background. So what I did was we took a second speedlight, an SB28DX, connected to an SU4 wireless flash controller. We placed that speedlight on the background, pointed up at the ceiling, and the result is what you see here. A beautiful balanced exposure, background light, and the subjects in the background brought forth so there's more detail. The next series of photos, I used the SB50DX along with the SB28, and this was truly an exciting test here. I got a demonstration of how to pack a parachute, which was quite interesting on its own, and the challenge was, how do I light this? It was done on a very large table, so the first thing I did was I know I needed to get a high angle so I can shoot down on the scene. Once I got up on the ladder and I saw where I wanted to shoot, I needed to figure out how to light the scene. I took an SB50DX as my flash on camera, and I placed the infrared controller right on the flash head. I placed an SB28 on the table facing the Master Sergeant with a yellow filter on to provide warmth, and then in the background another SB28DX with another SU4 and an amber gel to provide warmth coming in to look like window light coming in from the back. The on-camera flash with the IR trigger triggered the two lights, and all you're seeing is light recorded by two speedlights, and I'm up on the ladder. Pretty much the same scenario was done on the right side, except that I didn't have the yellow gel warming up my front speedlight. Very effective way to shoot pictures. Very simple, 3 speedlights, 2 SB28s, 2 SU4s, and 1 SB50DX in my bag. A lighting studio on the fly. In the last multiple flash setup I have here, this is one you might encounter more typically. Here they have a subject in the background and a subject in the foreground, but the inverse square law prohibits us from lighting the subject in the back and the subject in the foreground with equal intensity. So you've got several decisions here. I could have gone to slow sync and brought up the ambient light level, but I was in a room that was heavily fluorescent lit. I would have been lit green in the background. So my only choice here was to place a second speedlight, and this time it was on the floor, slightly behind the Master Sergeant in the front, pointed at the sergeant in the back, and we lit him with multiple flash. Very simple 2-light setup that balances the foreground light with the background lighting. And it's important to note here that I tried to match the background with the foreground. I believe I was shooting around f8 here, and I tried to match that second light with that light of the second speed light. The LCD on my D1X is truly invaluable in this, but if you're shooting a film camera and you do this technique, that's where I recommend flash bracketing to try to control the amount of light coming out of each speed light. We're going to move on to some Q&A here, and I hope I've covered some technique and some technology and some product that will hopefully clarify some of these issues in flash photography that I know have been on your minds since you picked up a Nikon camera and a Nikon Speedlight. I've had some faxes already received this morning as I got to the studio, and I'll take one of those questions first. What are the most important flash accessories to have in your camera bag? Well, for me, the most important accessory to have is an SC17 off-camera cord. It allows you to take your flash off-camera up to about 5 or 6 feet away and position it in a way where the lighting looks as natural as can be. The second accessory is the SU4 wireless flash controller. This can be packed in any bag. It can be thrown in your pocket. It doesn't weigh anything. It's mere ounces, but it attaches easily to the bottom of your speedlight. There's a sensor on the outside here. It can be rotated for maximum position, and there's a switch on here for TTL, for manual control, and there's an audible switch on here as well. The other accessories I like to tell you to keep in your gadget bag would be a second speedlight. Really, to do truly effective flash photography, you're going to need a second speedlight. A simple 2-light setup provides you with great portrait control, lighting foreground to background, to place just the light on some area in the background of any type of photograph to add that other possibility of dimensional lighting. Another question I got this morning was, can I use a Kodak SB28D speedlight with the D1 series cameras? Well, the answer is yes, you can use it, but there is no TTL control. So you'd have to use that with the AA mode, non-TTL auto, using the sensor system on the camera. You can still choose an aperture with the sub-command dial of your camera, and that aperture will be transmitted to the SP28D, and the flash to subject distance will be guided on the back of that, but you will be using sensor from the front of the speedlight here. In multiple flash setups, then you can use any speedlight you want, because you're going to go manual with those multiple flash setups. So if you own an SP28D and you want to know what other flash you should be purchasing, I would say get the SP28DX or the SP50DX, and they will work perfectly with your multiple flash scenarios. Please call in your questions at 1-800-524-8842. Another question that came through is, what is a great second flash to have in your camera bag for location or deployment use? If your main flash is the SP28 or the SP28DX, I would say a great flash for the second flash is another SP28 or another SP28DX. They're equal power, they have the same feature set, and they'll be totally familiar to you when you're working with them. So if you want to swap out one flash as an on-camera flash versus one flash as an off-camera flash, you can do it equally at will. Another possibility these days is that brand new SP50DX. Because of its lightweight capability and small compact size, it can pack and go anywhere. And it's versatile in its own right, and it can be used for DTTL on digital. It can be used for multi-sensor balanced fill flash on 35mm cameras as well. It can be used on our intermediate level cameras such as N80. You can use it with the built-in speedlight and the accessory speedlight together. It's a wonderful companion speedlight to use for multiple flash setups or just as an on-alone unit by itself. How many flashes can be used in a normal setup? Well, if you do a multiple flash picture using the SC18 or the SC19 cords, our instruction books will caution you that you can use up to 5 speedlights. If you're using a wireless setup, then you can use as many as your imagination will let you use. A couple of years back, we did a photograph to show just how you can use multiple speedlights in a scenario. We had a wonderful photographer, a National Geographic photographer, Joe McNally, do the photograph for us. And Joe created this wonderful tableau, this New York City tableau, a street scene. And in that street scene, he used 28 speedlights in wireless mode and lit from people in building into a telephone booth and people sitting on the corner. And it's a wonderful way to prove just how versatile the system is. But I don't know if you'll be packing 28 with you pretty soon. I will say you should be packing 2 or 3 with you all the time. Okay, we've got a call. We've got a call, and I'm trying to read that. And that's from Master Sergeant Dries in Wisconsin, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I wanted to just check with you. We do a lot of winter photography up here, of course, including flash. I was interested primarily in the power pack you have. Could you give us a picture of that, or at least tell us a little bit about it? It might be useful up here.
Yes, that's called the... Thanks, Mr. Sergeant. That's called the SD8A power supply, and it's a great accessory. If you excuse me for a second, I'm going to duck off camera for a second. It can be worn on your belt. It can be taken out of the pack. It's got a coiled cord that goes into the speedlight. And pull this piece off in front here. Put this in. Apply this coiled piece to the PC terminal of the speedlight, and you're good to go. Now the question was, in cold weather, how can you use this? And for me, cold weather, there is no better battery source than lithium batteries. They work great in cold weather. In here now, I'm packing in the new Kodak Photo, the Energizer Photo Lithiums. These work wonderfully in cold weather. And also the fact that you can take this SD8A and put it in your pocket and keep it as close to your body as possible for body warmth works terrifically in the speedlights. I don't know the time frame for how long you can shoot out in a very cold situation that you're probably in, and you'll probably know that quicker than I will. But if you take precautions like putting it in your pocket and keeping it as warm as that, and using the lithiums, I know they work wonderfully in all types of weather, including extremes in cold temperature. Another fax that came in is I know you shoot a lot with gels and your colored gels in your photography. Where do you get the gels to shoot with? Well, I do a couple of tricky and interesting things in my photography. I use gels for two reasons. One is for special effect to create a color in the photograph, and the other is to balance the exposure perfectly with the lighting conditions that I'm in. Now, digital photography has helped me do that. Shooting D1, shooting D1X and D1H, I am now free to set the white balance for whatever environment I'm in. So if I'm in a situation where I'm doing a formal portrait, and that might happen to be in a fluorescently lit room, I can pull out one of my green gels, which is balanced for fluorescent. I put some Velcro on my speedlights, Velcro on my gels, and I can put the gel on, and now I can make this flash a fluorescent light source and match that light source coming from above with the flash perfectly. And what I do is I go into pro camera stores and I get some Rosco packs and some Lee packs. I see what filter samples they have in there, and then I buy those filters. They make an extensive filter category. They make CTOs for warming. They make all kinds of colors, and my basic kit includes the fluorescent, tungsten balancing. Actually, matter of fact, it includes 2 of the fluorescents and 2 of the tungsten, just so I can do multiple flash, and includes some special effects filters, blues, reds, purples, yellows. Some great primary colors that I found in my photography really adds a great dimension to a background or foreground or an accent light somewhere else in the photograph. I always carry them with me, and it's really easy to carry and handy to do. Pretty much all the great photo stores have these accessories. I've got a phone call in from Pat from Texas. How you doing, Pat?
Mr. Silverman, very good. Just wanted to touch base with you in reference to that security police shoot where you used 2 and 3 flashes. Could you discuss your flash placement and mounting in the armory?
Yes, I can. I always carry with me, I've got a full gadget bag when I'm doing these photo shoots. And I always carry a clamp situation, a clamp just like this. Can put a speedlight right into the top. And very easily, I took the flash, mounted it into the clamp, and then was able to clamp it onto any surface. And what I did was I looked for those surfaces inside the armory, and in one case I found a ladder, and I stuck it on a ladder up high and then pointed at the subject. We found a locker that had enough space on it to clamp onto. And then the best of all is that I enlisted the aid of all the other people in the armory to help me and become light stands. I found this is a great thing to do when you don't have any accessories to mount them, is to enlist anybody who's around you. They generally find that when you do that, the lighting setup and the photograph takes on all new meaning. Everyone becomes involved in the photograph. It becomes an event when you're taking photographs, and people are glad to help you no matter where you're at. It's very simple. I just say, excuse me, can you please hold this flash over here for me just like this? And they generally love to, because they feel they're becoming involved in the photograph themselves. They're not just subjects in some case, but they're now participants in the photographs themselves. I also use the combination of going manual on my speedlight, manual on the camera, and what I did was once I set up the speedlight, remember it's flash to subject distance that governs the exposure. Once I got my primary exposure for the main light to come back to me, I balanced those secondary and third speedlights with that exposure so they would be equal to that, and in some cases slightly less intense than that, to give a great deal of dimension to the lighting scenario. Moving on to another fax that came through. Can we match the speedlight white balance to the scene? Well, I covered that briefly, but I'll explain how I do that again. And that's quite a great new technique that I've learned to do with my digital SLR, and I know you digital shooters out there will be interested to know how to do this. On D1 series cameras, there is a great feature called white balancing on the back of the camera here. You can have the camera do an automatic white balance, or you can have the camera balance for specific lighting situations, such as fluorescent lights, for tungsten lights, for a cloudy day, for a shouty day, or you can even do a preset balance off of a white card or a gray card. That's probably your most accurate way of shooting. Well, if you're going to use a speedlight in this situation, you've got 2 choices to make. One is you can make the speedlight the dominant light source, in which case you don't really have to balance the light source itself. Or you can choose to do what I like to do, which is to make the speedlight the same light source as the rest of the environment. In this case, interior lights like tungsten lights and household lights, or fluorescent lights like in office buildings and most big corporate centers. And then once I do that, the flash is now matching that light source. I turn my camera to that white balance correction, and I fire, and everything is corrected in the photograph. I just got another fax handed to me. Up. Thank you very much. Nikon dude. This is from Al Schulte. Al says, first of all, I speak for all Nikon shooters and the VI community when I say that we appreciate these training programs. Well, we're happy to do them for you, and we'd like to do more for you, Al. Thank you very much. Al's question is, does Nikon plan to make a module flash adapter for a quantum battery pack? If not, why not? Speedlights are great, but because since they eat up so much AA battery power, I just used an old Vivitar flash head with the quantum on my D1. Well, unfortunately, Al, we don't make accessories for independent manufacturers' products, and that's been throughout the history of our product line. And you're always going to find out there products, especially flashes, that either probably going to have more power or have more versatility to them or more long life and longevity. What we do in our Speedlight line is we make our Speedlights that match our camera technology perfectly. We make it so that it can be used for a broad range of photographers from professional to amateur. We use them so that they don't exceed the specifications and the electronics in the product. And we make them so that they're designed and integrated into the system seamlessly. He talks about why not, we're running out of juice. That way I can shoot all day and not run out of juice. I'm not sure if you saw my little spiel on the SD8A, but I've been using these successfully for a very, very long time, and I know dozens and dozens of pro shooters up in the New York area who rely on these SD8As for extended shooting with film cameras. Typically when you're on TTL, if you're shooting fill flash, it's about 17 to 18 rolls of film you can get. I deal with a wedding photographer up in New York who shoots with the SD8As, and he tells me for interiors at weddings he gets 12 to 13 rolls of film out of it, and then he swaps out batteries and he uses rechargeable batteries. Also, our Speedlight system is of a low voltage type Speedlight, and that's why you see AA's in here, and they can be AA of any capacity. Those AA's can be AA alkalins, they can be AA lithium, they can be AA nickel metal hydride, or they can be double metal AA nickel cadmium, all low voltage power sources. A power source like the quantum battery might use would be a high voltage source and would not be compatible with these Speedlights. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future, but I can tell you that we're always working towards improving our flash system and coming out with more products that work with the way you like to shoot and for the type of photography you like to do. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back. Hello, welcome back. For those of you who have missed it, the phone number to call in to ask some questions is 1-800-524-8842. And if you want to fax in your questions, it's DSN 266-3880. If you've been out there and you watched that little slideshow that just went on, you probably noticed that I used a great deal of flash in my photography there. And let me give you a little brief background on the history of how I came to know so much about flash photography. When I started out in photography, I was an ambient light shooter only. I used to tell people it wasn't my style to use flash, and it really wasn't the way I like to shoot. The reality of the situation was I didn't really know how to use the flash properly, and I was a little bit intimidated by it. I took the time to learn how to use the flash. I experimented a lot. I burned a lot of film. I made a tremendous amount of mistakes, but I learned from those mistakes. I laid out my film. I would look at the film and say, why is it this way versus that way? I was trying to do one thing, it came out another way, and I would record those notes and I would go right out and shoot that scenario again, trying to rectify the problem. One day, the light bulb went off and just said, this is how it's supposed to be made. And I learned a little more about flash photography. And once I got my feet wet and I could show that I had some successful flash pictures, I moved on to the next step. And the next step for me was on-camera flash was the first step. The next logical step was off-camera flash. I had heard about it, but I was even more intimidated about that than taking the flash off camera. I was worried that I wouldn't know how to calculate the exposure once it was off the camera, and I was worried about every aspect of the exposure process itself. And once again, I took that cord out, put my flash off camera, and then started to experiment. That's when I learned how to use the other controls in the camera to help me. Flash bracketing, for instance, the different light meters in the camera. What would one shooting mode be over another as far as how to make this picture? And my education began to grow and continue. Today, in my gadget bag, you find pretty much everything I've got out here. This is from my gadget bag. I carry with me accessories like clamps. I carry different gels for different purposes that I've explained before. I carry a series of light modifiers from soft boxes to bounce cards that I use. I carry these domes here that make the light go omnidirectional all over the place for nice soft lighting. And if you look now, they even come color-coded for correcting those different light sources that we talked about. It's a wonderful way to shoot. And if I can get you to take your flashes off camera, that would be the best lesson I can give you today. Get it off camera, get a second Speedlight out there, and start making multiple flash pictures. One of the faxes I got is, can you explain how you would cover a photo story? And I was thinking about that and not having a lot of experience for what you ladies and gentlemen do for your daily jobs, but being over here at the Air National Guard, I was given a brief tour of different facilities and things that were happening, and I came across a tanker. And I was thinking about the tanker just on my own, like how would I light this and what would I do with this? It's very, very challenging, and that will give me a lead-in to tell you about how I might follow a photo story. So here's the photo story. You got a tanker that's going up. It's going to be refueling some F-16s up there somewhere. Okay, so the first thing I would be doing is I'd probably be covering the guys and gals as they'd be suiting up somewhere. Get them suiting up, get them going through their mission. That could be an on-flash shot. It can be an off-flash shot. That's only one where you'll know when you get into the situation and you feel it out. It might even be an overall shot of a room interior, of everyone waiting for their orders and coming in, and maybe just even some of the camaraderie and the talking amongst one another before you even go out for your job anyway. Then I might get them coming out and going up the stairs. And that's going to be a fill flash photo too, because you're outside. You're going to have a wide contrast range between maybe the shadow of the hull of the airplane and then the light itself. Fill flash. What better way to do it than with a Nikon Speedlight and a Nikon camera? Get into the fuselage of the plane, and now everyone takes their positions. I'd scope it out, see where people are sitting, what they're doing. Knowing me, I'd probably want to go for an interior shot of the whole airplane. And to me, that's grab a tripod, put my camera on a tripod, either put my Speedlight on camera or off, or use several Speedlights, possibly use slow sync technique to balance the low ambient light with the flash, and I'd bang off a couple of shots there. If I was using a film camera, it'd certainly be flash bracketing. If I was using digital, I'd be previewing on my LCD and fine-tuning the exposure as I went along. Okay, then from there, I'd move and see what's interesting. And what's interesting to me as a layperson is I'd probably go up to the cockpit and see what's going on up there. I've never shot like that, but I bet dollars to donuts you can get a great shot of the pilots themselves and the view outside their window, especially if it's some exciting scenery. Well, that doesn't get any wider contrast range than an interior shot looking out into the opening, and particularly where there's an expansive blue sky or great scenery. And that's where you got to trust that technology, take into account what you've already learned and how to master that technology, and apply those techniques to that situation. I'd probably take my Speedlight off camera. I'd probably bounce it into the cockpit to get a nice wraparound lighting, and I might even put a second Speedlight out of picture view somewhere, either lighting the cockpit dashboard itself, or maybe one of the pilots or a co-pilot doing something, maybe put a colored gel on. Imagine trying that same shot at night. I'd probably use all colored gels on those Speedlights and light one of them blue, one of them red. Look really, really high tech and really cool. Okay, then I'd probably move on, and since this is a tanker and they're going to be refueling some planes out there, I'd probably want to go out there and go over to the boomer in the pod. And I understand there that they lay down on their bellies and they're watching the cable go down to refuel the planes. Well, that's got to be a challenging and exciting photograph itself. And you're back again to an extremely wide contrast range of how to light this. And again, fill flash is really the answer it's going to be, and you might have to take that flash off camera to light that scenario, especially if you were going to try to get the shot of the boomer, what's beyond him, which is probably the glass out front while he's lowering the cable, and then an F-16 or whatever planes might be there underneath him. That's a tremendous challenge right there. I'd probably meter the outside with a center-weighted meter and then try to balance an interior with that. And then I'd follow everything else on the day-to-day that goes on in that situation. People talking, communicating, going about their jobs, doing their thing, coming in, back, landing. I'd do the whole thing and walk through them and follow until the end when they took off their gear and went home for the day, and that would be the end of my assignment. I would cover it from beginning to end. And I can assure you that a minimal amount of that photography would be done without flash. I'm sure you could do it, but I'm sure a minimal amount. So it becomes really important of just how to use that flash to your advantage. The trick is to experiment, to use some of your, I know you don't get much free time. I have a joke in my family, the only free time I have is when I have no free time. But when in my free time, I'm always experimenting out there shooting and trying a new technique. If I try one new technique a week or one new technique a month, I can come up with some wonderful things to do with flash, and it makes me that much sure of myself. The next time I go out and take pictures, I don't hesitate. I embrace the challenge and I go after it. A Nikon Speedlight system in its depth, with all the accessories, with what we have to offer, our toll-free line for any technical help like that, is a wonderful resource for you to use. Just handed another fax. This is from Don Taggart. And Don says, does Nikon have a program that I can have our D1 modified to a D1X? Wouldn't we like that all, Don? If not, why? The cameras have so much in common. Well, D1X is an entirely different camera, Don, than D1 is. Although they have the same appearance and outward appearance of being very similar, D1X is quite different. The software in the camera is entirely different. The algorithms that run the software are different. D1X has an all-new anti-noise strategy. It's got a new LCD on the back of the camera that gives 100% viewing with white light, so it's brighter. It's got an all-new menu access system built into the camera. In fact, some of the controls for handling white balance and things like that on the back of the camera are duplicitous in that they can handle 2 or 3 different functions now. So it is not the same camera. It is it's like taking a Chevy that you would drive for street use and then putting in the greatest engine and all kinds of trick stuff and then running it out at some sort of like motor event somewhere. It looks like a Chevy on the outside, but it's not on the inside. We did the D1 Quick Start show. We're considering this for a future show. Oh, okay. I don't know if you saw it, Don, but a little note to me was that we did a D1 Quick Start show, and we're possibly looking at this for a second show and maybe a D1 show more in advance to show you just what the D1, the D1X, and D1H can do. And that's not a problem. So I hope you're enjoying your D1 because it was a camera I cut my teeth on, and it was a remarkable, remarkable learning experience and expanded my horizons as a photographer in ways I didn't think possible. After 20 years of shooting, I thought I'd seen it and done it, and that was it. And once I picked up a camera like a D1 with its control and white balance and all that it can do, my eyes were open to limitless possibilities, of which I'm still learning how to do with D1X and D1H, which is quite remarkable. And what I find is now I go back to my film cameras. I go back to an F5 and I go back to an F100, and I apply a lot of the things that I've learned with D1X about white balance and lighting, and I apply those to the film cameras. So it comes two ways. It comes full circle on how you learn. It's quite interesting and quite remarkable. What websites do you think we should regularly visit? That's a great question. Nikon is very active out there in the web community, and we have a site called NikonUSA.com, which is an extensive site for product information. If you have a question about product, its specifications, what it looks like, what accessories might go with it, well, NikonUSA.com is the place to go. Within NikonUSA.com, we have a feature called Nikon Net. And in Nikon Net, we feature the world's greatest professionals, and sometimes not even professional photographers. From nature, wedding, portrait, military, photojournalism, we have them all up there. And you could read their stories, you can learn their techniques, you can learn about what they're doing and what the latest trends in the industry are, and we have links to different sites from there itself. Another great resource, and one that I use a lot, is robgalbraith.com. Now, Rob was a staff photographer for a newspaper up in Canada, and he's been gone digital for over a decade now, and he brings not only insight into photojournalism, but he brings insight into digital photojournalism, and he talks about techniques with our cameras as well as others, and he talks about the latest trends, and he's got links to different sites from photographers all over the world, and it's a great, great, great resource for any kind of information, from lens selection to what flash works with this product, and what compact flash card should I use for this, and so on and so forth. Great place to go, robgalbraith.com, Nikon USA, and Nikon Net. Great places to visit on the web. Do you use any light modifiers for your photography? Well, I certainly do. As I showed you before, I carry these with me wherever I go. It's not so much that I'm interested in the quantity of the light. That I have a handle on through the technology. What I'm more interested in is the quality of light, and that is a far more harder discipline to learn than all of this hardware stuff. And anytime I can alter the quality of that light, make it softer, make it harsher, make it more direct, I take that opportunity and that chance to do it. I will sometimes back myself up and take the standard on-camera flash, no trick shot, just so I can say I have that as a fallback, but chances are it's just that, it is just a fallback photograph and nothing more than that. I got a question on, you explained slow and rear sync. Can you go through that one more time and give us the situations on when you would use slow sync versus rear sync? And if we can do that, if we can go to control room and bring that section up on slow sync, I'll go through that one more time. I'll go into it in a little more detail, and we'll see where we can get to. We ready to run? Well, I guess not, so I'll start explaining it. The process is this. You've got normal synchronization, which is the camera fires as you release the shutter release. That's good for outdoor photography, indoor photography, whenever you're doing grin and grip and you've got to nail that shot. The camera will synchronize from 1/60th of a second up to its highest sync speed. In the case of a film SLR, it's a 60th of a second to 250. In the case of a digital SLR, it's a 60th of a second to 500. Can you backtrack a couple of slides on that? Keep going. A couple more right here, and start me off with flash synchronization. Okay, now slow sync does the same thing that normal sync does, except now that the camera has freed itself, more or less, so that it can choose a shutter speed beyond that 60th of a second. So for instance, if your ambient light exposure without flash called for 4 seconds at f11, and you activated slow sync and you had f11 set, the camera would choose 4 seconds at f11 with flash, providing a natural balance between the ambient light and the SPEEDLIGHT's light. It's a great technique. Rear synchronization is exactly the same, except the flash fires at the end of the exposure and preserves natural trails of light. Okay, so what I like to do is I specifically use slow synchronization on static subjects. I'm on a tripod, my subject isn't moving, could be statuary, could be a tabletop, could be a floral arrangement, could be the interior of a room, I choose slow sync. Anytime motion comes into play in that photograph, someone riding a bike, someone helicopter moving, someone riding a motorcycle, Jeep, whatever it is, and I want to preserve that feeling of motion and have a natural trail behind the subject, then I choose rear synchronization. If you have a static subject and you choose rear synchronization, it's not a mistake. You don't have to panic. The photograph will come out great. Just be aware that that flash is going to go as the shutter curtain closes. So your timing is different. And that requires a little bit of patience and a little bit of learning to learn about that timing issue. It's a lot of practice, but it's one you have the most fun with. Next time you're out shooting in low light, whether it's at night or whether you're at sunset, you're out with a family, you're not on the job, so you don't want to, try something creative and not sure what's going to happen. Use your family. Have them ride bicycles, have them run, have them do gymnastics, whatever it is in the course of the day. Get in a car yourself. Hold that camera and speed light as you're driving along and see what happens as you drag the shutter. Those are the proving grounds for these techniques. And once you fine-tune those techniques there, then you can go out and in your daily work, you can apply those techniques that you've learned creatively to come across and build the shot. It might be the difference in someone in your group getting a shot of a scenario that's pretty much identical, and when the editor looks at it, and he looks at yours where it's got motion and it's got some things happening in it that preserve the effect and the mood of the scene without just destroying it and look like a total blur, and the person that's got the shot that's totally static and stoic, the editor might go, you know what, that shot with the movement is certainly different. I'm going to run that one just because it is so different. It's a great technique to use. Okay, I got a notice handed to me that we've got some future shows planned for you, but there are no dates set. We've got a show on Nikon capture software. And Nikon capture software for the D1X and D1H is an entirely new software from what D1 had. It has more control to it, and it has some great new features that I think you'll really enjoy, and we'll be doing that. And then we'll be doing a D1X and a D1H quick start program. And I think you'll really enjoy that because you'll see just how different this camera is from D1 and whatever else that's out there on the market. If you need to get information from Nikon, you need to contact your Nikon government account manager. His name is Pat Nugent, and you can reach Pat Nugent at pnugent.nikon@attglobal.net. That's pnugent.nikon@attglobal.net. Okay, so summing up, we've got an extensive flash system that's got flashes, SB28 and SB28DX on the high end, which have automatic zoom from 24 to 85, cover 18 millimeter, have the ability to go rear and slow sync, have the ability to shoot with FP sync. They have full manual control and power ratio to 1/64th power. They have flash compensation. They can bounce the light. They can swivel the light for complete control. And there's an AF illuminator built in so you can focus in very, very low light. Moving down to one of our newest speed lights, but one that I'm sure will be joining your gadget bags very shortly, the SB50DX. It's compact, lightweight, powerful, and it's got built-in wireless control automatically for you to use. And then we've got that full system of accessories from the SE17 to the SU4, which go in my gadget bag everywhere I go, and I know that they'll be in your bag everywhere you'll go too. For Nikon, I'm Lindsay Silverman, and thank you for listening.